one of the reasons for selecting this presentation was because the Potomac chapter was very gracious in submitting a recommendation for approving the NRHS grant for repairing windows. Some were cracked, some were missing, and then reglazing and repainting the windows. So you can see how many windows there are, and this is just the front side of the building. On the ends and the back side, there's just many windows. And so it was a big restoration undertaking. The grant was very helpful, and I personally want to thank all the members of the Potomac chapter for having supported that recommendation to national. So what we're going to do today, this is obviously a little different than most of your railroad presentations, because we're not talking about locomotives, we're not talking about passenger cars. We're really talking about a cake slice of history through the years. And so we're going to talk about briefly the Shenandoah Valley Railroad that lasted about a decade, then its absorption into the Norfolk and Western Railway. Then we'll turn to part of the reasons why, for a town of 600 people, you have a big station that's 141 feet long and 26 feet wide, built of masonry. That's covered under the Clark County and Boyce citizens. Talk about the station design, and then the agents and clerk who worked there, and then a little bit about the depot afterlife. This is one afterlife that I'm happy that I can provide some information about. So I have no photographs actually of what the area looked like. It's on the Saratoga estate where they built the track that came through, basically through dense woods, and crossed the the Winchester and Berry's Ferry Turnpike. At that time, most of the roads that are free to us now were turnpikes, and it was no different. There was this turnpike that ran from Millwood, which is about 3 miles east of the station, to Winchester, which is about another 7 miles to the west. And where the turnpike crossed this track, a little town sprang up, and it was decided that they would name it Boyceville, or Boyce later on. So the Shenandoah Valley Railroad was really anticipated by the Clark County residents because, for two reasons. Number one, at the time, the Winchester and Potomac, later on the B&O Railroad, really had a lock on the freight traffic in this area. And so freight rates were relatively high, no competition, all the usual things that you hear about wanting to get some railroad competition. And then the other aspect was it's basically a 10-mile wagon ride from Millwood to get over to Winchester through some very rolling hills, which you can still, if you're in Boyce and you take the West Main Street to where it intersects US Highway 50 again, you get a taste of that. That's the original alignment of that turnpike. And then you can imagine some of the hills along US Highway 50, what exists there now, as what it was like to actually try to get a wagon up and down those hills loaded with grain or any other items that you wanted to ship, either outbound or receive inbound on the B&O. So having a railroad at your doorstep that was 7 miles closer was certainly a big advantage. And this is the only railroad that runs through Clark County. So in particular, Clark County and parts of Warren and Shenandoah County were railroad. Now, the original charter and the construction stalled during the 1870s. And there was a construction firm that apparently was collecting a lot of money and not doing a whole lot of contract work. And after that, they got involved and construction restarted in 1879 under a different structure. And then from that point, it really started moving. Now, the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, as most people know, runs from Hagerstown down to Roanoke now. Originally, the track was laid to Charlestown, West Virginia. It was undecided where it would go north of Charlestown, and finally it was determined there would be a connection with the Cumberland Valley Railroad. So anyway, this town of Boyce sprang up, and after that, this village grew at that road and railroad intersection. And I should say that not only did you save that 7 miles of hilly road trying to get over Winchester, you save some money from the tolls. Upton Boyce lived on the nearby Tuileriers estate, which is about 2 miles as a crow flies from where the depot is located. And actually it was, I guess it was classified as a Millwood, not a Millwood, as a White Post address. But he was the vice president of the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, and he's credited for arranging the financial support and taking care of the legal matters of this new railroad. And just as an aside, on July 4th, I was fortunate to acquire 25 pounds of his personal papers that had laid dormant since his death in 1907. And my current project is trying to straighten those out. And in the course of doing that, I'm finding how many fingers he had in all sorts of different projects, as well as how much he was personally impacted by some of the financial panics that affected the railroad. But anyway, so since there was a new village, since there was no village there, it was named Boyceville. Now, the post office that was established on May 31st, 1880, was always named Boyce. It was never called Boyceville. And the picture that's down at the bottom is what the original station looked like. This is a standard design for the Shenandoah Valley Railroad. The building in the foreground was replicated at Berryville and Shepherdstown and Luray and all of these other locations. Now, behind that, you see some other white buildings. That's the Page and Garvin warehouse. If you had a shipment come on in and you wanted it held at a warehouse, Page and Garvin would accommodate that. It was basically a contract warehouse. So all the grocers and everybody like that were using that as a storeroom for stock before they needed it in their stores. So we turned to the Norfolk and Western era in 1890. And John Wright had done this photograph. It's one of my favorites of, he specializes in night photography, and took a picture of a southbound train coming into Boyce with headlights shining onto the depot. The N&W completed acquisition of the Shenandoah Valley Railroad during 1890, but prior to that, both railroads, both the Norfolk and Western Railroad and the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, were in receivership. And I'm still trying to understand exactly what the circumstances were during that financial panic of around 1884, 1885. But traffic basically dropped off a cliff, and they had all these bonds that the Shenandoah Valley Railroad had to service. And so basically it went into foreclosure. Now, once it was integrated into a larger railway system, it was called the Shenandoah Division of the Norfolk and Western Railway. And the portion that's south of Shenandoah is the Roanoke subdivision. North of that's Hagerstown subdivision. And that lasted pretty much until the Norfolk Southern era. Merchandise and bulk commodity traffic traveled over this route. It was really the Norfolk and Western's connection to reach the Pennsylvania Railroad to the north, whereas most of the N&W was east-west, and the only other place the N&W touched the Pennsy was at Columbus, Ohio, or Cincinnati. And of course, there was through sleeping car service between New York City and Roanoke. That's one of the, I think, fairly remarkable things that you could get on a train at Boyce at midnight and wake up at Penn Station, New York at 8:30 in the morning, and likewise come back down. And quite a few of the very wealthy people that funded the construction of the depot or the enhanced depot, they were going to New York City periodically or to Philadelphia to meet with stockbrokers. So, this I've in the past equated this to building Dulles Airport in your backyard. Plus that, it provided connections to the west and south to all those cities that are on what's now the Southern Railway system. So we'll talk briefly about Clark County and the Boyce citizens. Now, most of you are aware of where Boyce is, but if you go there, the real center of attention for this presentation are these three estates that are located to the east side of Boyce town limits. One is called Scaleby, the other one's Saratoga, and the other is Powhatan. And Powhatan, the land is now occupied by a private school. Saratoga has its own history, goes way back, and it's still basically a farm. Scaleby was formerly owned by a Gilpin family, as I'll touch upon in a second, a very expansive and very nice piece of property that all three of these people were gentlemen horse farmers. The owners were basically raising fancy stock, as they call it on the railroad. I'll touch upon that when I get into the freight shipments. So, for the first 2 decades of the 20th century, that was really the railway age, as most of us know. The route miles, train services, and amenities increased all the way up until World War I. And the N&W, like many other railroads, was improving railroad stations. So around 1912, it decided that it would replace the 1880 Shenandoah Valley Railroad Depot at Boyce, and was planning on spending $7,500 to build another style of wooden depot that would be on the town side of the track instead of being on this east side. These three Clark County families, the Gilpin family, Mayo, and Page, they collectively donated $17,500 and donated it to the N&W. I'm not sure that the amount was raised equally among those three people, but whatever it was, it totaled to that amount. And that, along with the original $7,500 budget, allowed for building a truly first-class station of the 1910s era that had inside plumbing, it had electric lights, had central heating. It was a masonry station and was very, very attractive. Plus that, they bought additional land thinking that there'd be additional room for growth from a 1/4 acre to 2 acres. We'll talk about each of these estates and the people because they figure very much into the history of Boyce Depot. Hattie Newcomer married Henry Gilpin, and they were both sort of wealthy in their own way. Hattie was the daughter of a Baltimore bank president, and Henry Gilpin was the heir to a Baltimore pharmaceutical company. They built this Scaleby mansion, which is still there. You can see it from the road. Very impressive. A lot of postcards were made of it. If you go onto eBay and do a search for Scaleby, you'll see these postcard images. And that was constructed between 1909 and 1911. All that construction material was transported to Boyce by the N&W. And so that was a nice piece of freight traffic coming on into the station. Uh, and aside from donating for the Boyce Depot, I think Harriet Newcomer um, or Hattie Gilpin was really the driving force for some of this, because I think she heavily influenced the design of the station, such as putting the men's room out so that it was accessed from the platform instead of the large waiting room, and so on. But she was a philanthropist, and donated money for a rectory at Millwood, a parish hall at Boyce Chapel, and a children's playground in Winchester. So then there's another fellow that for a while was a little bit of a mystery to me. All I ever saw was just the initials P.H. Mayo. He married into a very prominent family up there called Burwell at Carter Hall. If you go visit Millwood, there's the Burwell Morgan mill that's been restored by Clark County and does grinding. A very established family within Virginia history, along with the Carter family. And so he was buying land from Powhatan. Now, Mayo's father had been a tobacco manufacturer prior to the Civil War. He and his brother reestablished tobacco processing and became some of the wealthiest people in Richmond, Virginia. And he sold out his tobacco business to Continental Tobacco, which basically, if you go to Richmond, go to Churchill, and you see what has been converted to condos, it's a Lucky Strike on the side. That was essentially the factory that was established by Peter H. Mayo. And you go down that hill and you're down in Fulton Yard on the C&O. But anyway, so because tobacco is a high value revenue product, Mr. Mayo was well known to railroad management. It was apparently well liked. And so he is the person who probably did the negotiation with the Norfolk and Western Railway to coordinate the fundraising, and probably contributed, in my view, most of the money that probably went towards the bigger station, and then, working it out with the Norfolk and Western Railway. Unfortunately, as I've gone through the Norfolk and Western archives, I've yet to find anything that really described that transaction about receiving the money and allocating it to the construction of the Boyce Depot, although I've found many other documents pertaining to the Boyce Depot construction. But anyway, he had a lot of influence. And so basically, the area just outside of Boyce was his summer home, get away from the heat of Richmond during the summer and head on up to Clark County. And then Robert Powell Page, on the other end, Robert Powell Page and his ancestors have lived in that area of Clark County for a long, long, long time on the Saratoga estate, which was one of the oldest estates predating even Clark County, because Clark County broke away or was formed out of Frederick County, which is where Winchester is. He also was married into this Burwell family. If you look at ancestry family trees, I've prepared a few, you see all these interrelationships, much like the royalty in England. I think there were strategic marriages to try to join family fortunes. Aside from donating funds for the new station building, the land that became the 2-acre lot for Boyce Depot came from his family. So that was perhaps his biggest contribution, the willingness to go ahead and sell that 2-acre lot. And they also own another farm just to the west of Boyce Town called Pagebrook. We'll talk briefly about the railroad depot itself. And this drawing here is not a construction drawing for Boyce Depot. This is from Charlestown, West Virginia. Charlestown was built a year after Boyce was completed in 1913. Charlestown was built in 1914. Charlestown, before they tore it down, if you had seen it, was brick construction. Boyce Depot is clay block with stucco. It's probably the only N&W station on the system that had clay block with stucco. And but the design features are almost identical as you look at the drawings. So this is the bay window, which when you see me with the background image that I use for my when we go into where you can see me, I'm sitting in front of a view that looks basically at the operator's bay window there. The new building was just down a little further south from the original Shenandoah Valley Railroad Depot. So they existed concurrently until it was time to close out the Shenandoah Valley Railroad Station and move, a few hundred feet into the new Boyce Depot. They had a funny arrangement in Boyce that I won't go into a lot of detail, that the house track or public delivery track had been around behind a mill for grain owned by a fellow by Laws. And so anyway, they straightened that out to where there was a house track which actually ran from the south of the depot around to an embankment behind the depot. And then as with many of the train stations in Virginia on the N&W Railway, John P. Pettyjohn Company of Lynchburg, Virginia constructed it, and it was believed to have been finished around October 1913, and with November being the move-in date. So probably by Thanksgiving in 1913. That's one of the other things that I've been trying to search through. I was hoping to find in the Clark Courier or other local newspapers some sort of an article that says, the news station's open. But I have yet to find that, but hope springs eternal. So Boyce had about 350 residents in 1913. It's just shy of 600 residents now, so it's roughly double, but in either case, it's very, very small. And I'm not going to read through all of this. There's a handout that you can get. It's a PDF file that has all this information, as well as the notes pages, which have more pictures, more information about what I'm talking about. But George B. Harrison, who was an attorney in 1914, wrote about very lavishly a description of what the new Boyce Depot was. We're going to turn now and talk about the four agents that worked there at Boyce, not counting relief agents, people who were just worked there a day or two. There were four agents who bid on the assignment and had it as a permanent position. And then there was one clerk that I can identify that was working there. So this here is what the floor layout of the depot looks like. And this came from a print in 1955 when they converted it, part of it, to a post office. The area that's the larger waiting room to the right became the post office, which is why it's saying partition and lobby there. And then the work area was in the rest of the waiting room. And then they shifted all the other passengers into the smaller waiting room that's to the left in this drawing. So this is a little bit of railroad history here that some of you are probably acquainted with. Most small depots had a person with the title agent operator. And it was filled by seniority, assuming the person met the qualification requirements. And an operator meant that the person was a telegrapher. He was a telegraph operator. So during the later years, that requirement was relaxed and a person used railroad telephone communications. And when I was working for the C&O in the 1970s, that was a big advantage for me. I was an agent operator, but everything was telephone by then and allowed me to work without learning Morse code. Um, and Reflecting back, I mentioned that these landowners around Boyce Depot were mostly horse farmers. They were raising race horses. You had three reasons why the agent operator at Boyce demanded a lot of seniority to be able to bid in on that assignment. One racehorse being shipped to one of the racetracks, such as Pimlico or Hialeah or any of these other places, the express company paid a commission, and frequently that commission could be as much or more than what the agent received from the Norfolk and Western for a full month's wages. The clerk was assigned to perform. There was also a clerk there, so the agent operator didn't have to concern themselves with station accounting or tariff filing, and that was a nice little perk. And then, you had basically 350 people that you took care of. A few were very wealthy. The rest were just, a few others were middle class, and the rest of the people were just very ordinary people that if they could afford a coach ticket to go down to Front Royal or up to Berryville, they were probably doing okay. But it was a manageable workload for a small community. So for these three reasons, again, people really wanted to get at Boyce Depot. And once they bid in on that assignment, they stayed there. And in a couple cases, they stayed there for life. The first one we'll talk about is Morris Dunlap. He was born in 1867 in Pennsylvania. And said that in one of the NW magazines that he was a go-getter, that he actually petitioned the town of Ripon to go ahead and establish a station and that he could become the agent operator there. Eventually, he worked his way up to Boyce in 1886, well before the time that the current station was built. Mr. Dunlap still recorded as agent in 1905, and he purchased a house in Boyce, 1896. The house is still there. It's about a block and a half from the depot, so he had certainly a very, very nice commute. And he's got the distinction of being the longest serving agent, although most of those years were in the former Shenandoah Valley Railroad wooden depot. He continued until he died from a stroke in 1929, a few months before the stock market crash. And he was also a member of the town council between 1916 and 1928. And so he was also involved in the local town politics. The next agent from 1929 to 1932 was Tom Sheets. He was born in Charlestown. He had served as a train dispatcher, found that there was too much stress in that job. So he shifted back to agent operator roster, where, you get back to the station and it's a lot less hectic. His life also tragically ended, and he actually died in the agent's office. Well, I'm sorry, he collapsed. Somebody found him and took him to the doctor. There was no hospitals, of course, in that era, so you took him to the doctor's office. And he said, oh, well, he's feeling a little better and wanted to go home. And he died a few hours later in the late evening. It says that, he died of acute indigestion, but really what I think was that he had an ulcer that perforated, and basically the acid just ate away at his innards. So he had the shortest tenure at Boyce of the four regularly assigned agents. This is Mr. Lane, seated at his desk. This is the only interior photo I've been able to find at Boyce Depot, and it's been my guide for trying to do what I can, clutter aside, for trying to get the interior to look like it did back in 1934. But he apparently hired a professional photographer, came in, and all the office safe and the clock and telegraph wiring was over on the side of the wall that you cannot see. But basically, this is, how it looked. And a comment about that desk, that's about the size of a king-size bed. In an office the size of Boyce Depot's agent's office, it's properly proportioned, doesn't look that big. However, I own a desk that was used in the Motive Power building, had it moved in, and that's equal size. And in a house, it would basically take up an entire room without any other furniture. So anyway, he lived at 11 East Main Street, and there's a lot to be said about his life, but I'm going to pass on that right now. Lee Chester Murray was the agent at White Post for quite a few years before bidding on Boyce, after Sylvester Lane retired. And, he was the youngest of all agents of Boyce and had the second shortest assignment. He never moved to Boyce, didn't live in Boyce. He lived on Greenwood Farm near White Post and commuted the 7 miles each way by auto. At least I'm believing that he commuted by auto. It makes sense in the early 50s that that's how he was getting there, because there really wasn't train service that would have allowed him to go from White Post up to Boyce at the beginning of a tour or a trick and go back afterwards. So anyway, he for the years that he worked at the station between 1952 and 1958, he was driving back and forth. And of course, during this period of time, passenger freight, express, and telegram traffic just dropped off a cliff. And after that, with the diminishing revenue, the NNW petitioned the Virginia State Corporation Commission to close the agency. It basically closed on the last day that the station was open was December 31st, 1958. His retirement and the station officially closed on January 1st. Railroads typically will pick a legal holiday to close it, that the building would have been closed anyway, because there's no question, is it open that day or closed that day? So it technically did not last as an NNW agency, except on paper, into January 1st, 1959, December 31st, 1958, which coincides with my 7th birthday. I haven't figured out if the stars were aligned for that. Was the last day that Boyce Depot was used on the NNW. There was one clerk that I can identify because clerks do not appear on the seniority roster for agents and operators. It's a little more difficult to do research about them, but Arthur Lowe was a clerk. He did all the bookkeeping, tariffs, and stenography. And, most of the traffic was in the teens or 20s. And so he was there to handle that, probably also handled baggage and less than carload shipments and maybe even the express shipments. Not sure what else he may have done. He later, then in 30s and 40s, shifted down to Bassett, Virginia, as a clerk. Bassett is, as many of you all know, was a furniture manufacturing area. And that agency down there in Bassett had quite a few clerks at the station. He died in 1961 at Boyce, and his Alcinda was the telephone agent for Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone. And 127 East Main Street is where the telephone switchboard was for Boyce. And they had 3 telephone operators during the daytime, 1 at night. And it was the last Chesapeake and Potomac telephone exchange, manual telephone exchange. Boyce telephones did not have dials until 1968. So it was not the last place in Virginia for the operator assisted telephone calls, but it was among the last. So what's happened to Boyce after that? Well, we're trying to find other uses between 1959 and 2020. For a while, it was the town post office. It was also the fish charity was there. And then later on in the freight room, there was a Clark County Supply that used it as a warehouse for hay and for farm implements and so on like that. And then the station building started drifting into obscurity. It was owned briefly by the Winchester chapter of the National Railway Historical Society when there was a new post office built in Boyce in 1983. And after that, the person who owned the depot really didn't want it anymore because it required quite a few repairs and there was no income coming in. Winchester chapter ended up buying it. And then after a few years, they ended up selling it. It went to a fellow who did some woodworking in the freight room. And that lasted a couple of years. I think he had plans about trying to rent out the 4 different areas of the depot. And once he got into it, found that he could not do that because there are doors between those areas. And to be able to lease separate portions of people, portions of the station, you have to have a hard wall between them. You can't have the possibility somebody can go through a door and enter from within. So anyway, what's really happening now as they said on Saturday Night Live, the Church of What's Happening Now, I established a Boyce Railway Depot Foundation and looking for trying to transition it from private ownership to future public preservation of the depot. It's basically a nonprofit 501c3 organization. Foundation to manage or consistent with the town's heritage and history, and hopefully it'll also promote some tourism. So I'm going to skip over some of this. This is all in that handout. As Alex mentioned at the very beginning, this entity called the Railway Mail Service Library. That library collection is the reason why Boyce Depot was purchased, but we're trying to get a new building specifically designed as an archival library built behind 127 East Main Street, and that's adjacent to the railway depot, so that Boyce Railway Depot the items that are there can get moved out and the interior, a little bit of interior fixing up, mainly some fallen plaster or deteriorated plaster, which is not going to be terribly expensive to try to fix. For a station, I've told people that for a station that has not been a station since 1958, it still has all the attributes of a train station. The interior floor plan really was not changed significantly. So the idea is that there'll be Shenandoah Division artifacts in the agent's office. These newly acquired Upton L. Boyce personal papers will also be retained there, and some will be displayed as it relates to the Shenandoah Valley Railroad history. There'll be artifact displays in the express room, and then large waiting room and the freight room will be available for event rentals or model railroad club or layout. So for all this, you got to stay tuned. This is in the future, probably beyond my lifetime, but I'm trying to stick around as long as I can to bring it to fruition. And just so that you can guide that future, you can join. You can. You don't necessarily have to be a on the ground volunteer. There are things that you can do to help out with the Boyce Railway Depot Foundation. And we will be, after this COVID dies down again for the 3rd time or 4th time, however many times it is, we'll have periodic events there. So we hope that you'll visit and learn about Boyce Railway Depot history. That's what the membership application looks like in the handout that you get. That's a PDF file. It's in there. If you want to join, we'd love to have you. And also, too, just so that you know, if you order things from Amazon, the Amazon has a program they call Amazon Smile, where they give a 0.5% donation based upon your purchase price. And that is not increasing the price of the product to you. That's just out of their Amazon's pocket. And, it's nickels and dimes that add up, and it, maybe helps to pay for the light bill for 1 month. So there's a link there, but basically what it is, you log into Amazon Smile, and the numbers at the end are identify the nonprofit foundation that you want to do this for. This also works for the NNW Historical Society, for the National Railway Historical Society. So if you feel more compelled to try to donate money to those organizations, this is a good way to do it. But, remember BRDF. And also there's a book, if you join the Boyce Railway Depot Foundation, there's a children's story that I wrote. If you remember The Little Engine That Could when you were growing up, The Big Station That Did is a story that sort of doesn't say, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. But it talks about, the evolution that the station went through, and, how it applies to people in their own lives. You can always buy a copy for $10, but that happens to be the amount for the registration fee for a year in the Boyce Railway Depot Foundation. So just go ahead and join. You get the book, and happy reading, and you can give it to a grandkid. So we're at the stage now where I guess people can come off mute if they want to. If they have any questions, I'll be glad to give it some thought and try to provide an answer. And then I'll turn it back over to the Potomac chapter with thanks for having me this evening, and let you all have any other discussions that you want to have. And there's apparently quite a bit of stuff in the chat box. I'm not monitoring the chat box. I guess it was talking about the, it was talking about the echo. I heard that too. Okay, all right. So anyway, yes, the waiting rooms are segregated. I've been dancing around that by calling one the large waiting room and the one that's a small waiting room. They are not truly separate but equal. The large waiting room, obviously being larger, had some electric lights around the perimeter of the ceiling, which make it very attractive, and that's missing in the smaller waiting room. The restrooms were segregated, and the agent's office and the records room formed a complete partition between the two. You had to enter from the platform or for the parking lot side through doors that you could not go from. You could not go through doors, directly from one to the other. Although the agent could. There were doors on either side of the agent's office for him to go into either waiting room. Ted says trains 1 and 2 from New York to Roanoke were the familiar Winston Link. Yes. I don't think he ever took very many pictures of the local passenger trains. He preferred night photography, and that's exactly what trains 1 and 2 were. Took pictures, especially around Waynesboro and at Shenandoah Junction and Luray, some of the most well-known photographs. I sure wish he had picked Boyce, but he didn't. Some other recent photographers have done some flash photography there that I think is really very, very, very attractive. So that's all that I see in the chat box. Anybody else have any questions? You can come off of mute.
So the New York trains didn't stop at Boyce. It was just the local trains that stopped at Boyce.
No, the train, it was a flag stop. You had to be going north of Berryville and south of Luray or something like that. They did not want to have local traffic, but the trains going northbound, the train came in around midnight, and southbound, the train came in around 1:30 in the morning. And the agent, in the early days, what people don't realize is agents work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day for a day off. So added to that was the situation that Morris Dunlap and Mr. Sheets, Theodore Sheets. Anyway, they worked that 12-hour day before they instituted the 40-hour work week or 48-hour work week. Well, I guess it was 40-hour work week, and then they late during the war years of World War II, they changed it to 48 hours. But anyway, they were also expected to go down to the station in the middle of the night and open up the doors for the waiting room for those two trains. So here you are, you're working 12 hours, get about 3 or 4 hours a nap and a dinner, have to get up in the middle of the night, go back down to the station, unlock it for about an hour and a half. Then you go back home and sleep till dawn, and then you start it again because the hours were basically 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. for Boyce. Tough life. But, a lot of people aspired to being a station agent. And the nice thing was, in a small town, you had lots of time where you weren't rushed. You were basically, the nice thing about most of these railroad jobs, the thing that I enjoyed when I was a agent operator working in a small town, is you're there by yourself. You're sort of your own boss, unless you screw up. You're talking to the dispatcher or to other people on the telephone, but you're able to do things at your own pace. It has a lot of its advantages, and the wages were relatively good. In a small town, you could not find steady work with relatively good pay and 2 weeks paid vacation. The railroad job certainly provided that, as well as a pension after you retired.
Yeah, Frank, I took the 1968 excursion with a nickel plate 759 between Roanoke and Shenandoah Junction. And I guess we probably passed through Boyce if Boyce is south of or between those 2 points. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, I was chasing the 759 in that general area. It was a northbound trip that I was chasing. I think it was around 1969 or 1970. Anyway, it blew one of the cylinder heads north of Boyce. And, they ended up having to tow it up to Hagerstown, to the Hagerstown Roundhouse, and repairing it. But yes, those trips were going by Boyce. It would have gone by in the flash of an eye. You probably would not have remembered it. But yes, Boyce was right alongside of there. And there's only a few other stations that continue to exist on that line. There's still first of all, the station at Hagerstown is gone. The Antietam station has a model railroad club, but the wooden station was moved away from the tracks and turned 180 degrees. So the next station that you find that's really along the original alignment is Shepherdstown, and that's got a fence up in front of it. And then that's it until you get to Boyce. They tore down the Berryville station. After Boyce, there's still a station in Front Royal that is a relatively modern station. To me, it looks like the one that was at Radford, Virginia, where they built that in the early 1950s, I guess, just a very square brick building. And then Luray is still a nice station. They've done some heavy renovation there, sort of the model of what I hope that can be done at Boyce, Virginia, in terms of displays and so on like that. And then the station that's in Shenandoah Yard, that Shenandoah is still there. And further south, there's really, the stations that Winston Link was photographing at, Stanley, Elkton, Waynesboro, they're all gone, unfortunately. Fortunately, the photographs survive, but there's very, very little south all the way to Roanoke, anything that remains that's the original NW stations.
So in 1968, when I took that trip, the station was just dormant, or was anything going on restoring it?
In 1968, the station was used as the town post office.
Oh, okay.
So it would have had a sign outside. It would look pretty much like it does now. It on the northeast corner, it had the little sign that said post office, and people would not have been on the platform. They would have gone around, on the parking lot side and gone in through a door into that little vestibule to get mail out of a lockbox or use the window. There was a restaurant in there. I overlooked saying that there was a restaurant in there. After the station closed, a fellow bought it and created a restaurant that was pretty successful for 2 or 3 years. And, I have to give him a lot of credit from the standpoint that he had the building rewired. He had installed air conditioning and some better lighting, had ceiling fans put in and so on like that. The ceiling fans really aren't appropriate for the period of having the station look like it did back in 1958, but I just, squint and pretend like they're not there. But anyway, it was used as a post office at the time that train was going by. So that's one of the reasons, because Boyce was sold, the building was sold relatively early on in 1958, that the NW did not tear it down, and it's been privately owned ever since. And I'm just the latest of a succession of people that have owned it, and eventually the Boyce Railway Depot Foundation will probably be its owner. But for now, it's owned by the Railway Mail Service Library Incorporated, and I own 99.999% of the shares. The reason for that is if somebody got injured or killed and there was a big lawsuit, the most that they could collect from the Railway Mail Service Library Incorporated would be $70,000, which is the value of the building. That's what I paid for it. And the land is owned by Norfolk Southern. Norfolk Southern has a lease that can be canceled on 30 days notice, but it's been on 30 days lease since 1958. So, before I bought the station, I went to I visited the Virginia Division office down for Norfolk Southern in Roanoke, talked to the superintendent, and he said that they were planning on extending the siding north of Berryville up to Ashby, not to Ashby, but north of Berryville, and then the siding south from White Post down to Ashby, and that really became sort of like double track. That was all they were going to do. They weren't going to double track the whole line from Bristol all the way up to the Virginia state line at Gaylord. And he said that as long as the building's 25 feet from the center line of the track, that it'll probably be fine to let it stay there. No push from the railroad to try to move it. So the next thing I did, next day probably, was went out there with a tape measure, went to the center line of the track, went to the edge of the operator's bay window, which is the part of the building that's closest to the track, and it's 25 feet to the inch. So if you go there, you'll see that the track does not butt up against the platform. That's because in years of maintenance away work and so on, they gradually move the line away from the station. So that helped a lot too. Any other questions?
I was able to photograph the Berryville station in the 1980s. And if you were living in the area, was there any attempt to save that station? It's only 6 miles from Boyce.
Yeah, that's got its own interesting story, and all I can share is some hearsay that apparently, yes, there was a lot of interest in trying to go ahead, acquire that depot, and to then use it as the Clark County Historical Society, I guess, headquarters, and some people who really don't know how to work with the railroad very well, they were making all sorts of requirements and, so on like that for the Norfolk and Western Railway. It was still Norfolk and Western Railway at that time. And they did not think to just go ahead and say, let's buy the building and then work out a lease like existed Boyce. And, we'll own the building. It was still an N&W ownership, and they kept on making all these demands. So the N&W basically, as I understand it, had enough of that. They went in on a Labor Day with a bulldozer and just pushed it down, and that solved that problem. So that's the admonition to rail fans is there's a lot more stations that could have been saved if you just approach the railroad and say, I want to lease the building. Even if you don't buy it, I want to lease the building. As long as they're getting some revenue from it, a lot of times you can work out, it'll be a very one-sided deal for the railroad, but you can work out a deal for preservation. And fortunately, that's the case for Boyce.
Isn't there another railroad that crosses Shenandoah there near Berryville, Diamonds there?
No, that's at Charlestown. Charlestown is where the B&O Railroad crosses the Norfolk and Western Railway. Then you go further south to Riverton Junction, and the Southern Railway line that's now pretty much out of service. You have the Harrisonburg branch crossed the Norfolk and Western at Riverton Junction, went over to Strasburg, and then south towards Harrisonburg. So those are the, other than the connection with the Chesapeake Western Railroad down in Elkton, Virginia, which isn't a crossing, it's, basically just it was a interchange point behind the former Elkton station. And of course the C&O goes over top of the N&W at Waynesboro, and actually it's Basic City, not Waynesboro. Waynesboro is a short distance away. So when you see the Winston Link pictures of the Waynesboro station, it's really, it may say Waynesboro, but it's considered to be Basic City. And the C&O track, sometimes you can make it out in some of the pictures. That's going over top of the N&W track. Not very many east-west connections. And of course, the B&O coming down into Winchester that crosses at Charlestown, that's really, it's coming out of Martinsburg and going south. That's not really an east-west railroad. It just was a parallel line down the Shenandoah Valley. And so was the Southern Railway crossing Riverton Junction. That was just going down the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, Shenandoah Valley.
You should pass your trains that went north out of Boyce to New York City. When they got to Hagerstown, how did they get to New York?
Okay, well, and I can share there's been some recent, there's a fellow in New York City who's got some 1961 passenger train consist. And the only car that really went through is just one sleeping car from Roanoke to New York City. And so it was, but in the train that was coming north out of Roanoke, it had a coach, it had a railway post office car, 30-foot car that had express, and maybe a baggage car as well. It really was a fairly short train. I don't think if there were coaches, in earlier years, there may have been more than one sleeper and there may have been more than one coach. But towards the end, basically it was, as I understand it, a sleeper coach with some head end traffic in the locomotive. So it got to Hagerstown. Pensy put their locomotive on and basically took that consist up to Harrisburg. But at Harrisburg, that's where the coach and the head end equipment stopped. It was only the sleeping car that was switched out and went into a train that it made a connection with a train that they put it onto that took it in by way of North Philadelphia and went up to New York City, and the reverse for that coming south. If anybody's interested in any of those consists, I've saved a few of those, like I say, from 1961, that I can send you that sort of describe exactly sort of how that does and what train numbers there were. But the unfortunate thing, what really sort of began to kill the passenger service on the line was the Penske's determination that they would discontinue the trains between Harrisburg and Hagerstown. And there's nobody just going to Hagerstown from Roanoke. They're going beyond that usually, even if it's to make a connection to Harrisburg to some of the east-west trains. So when they lost that New York sleeper for a while, then they tried to interchange a sleeping car at Waynesboro to the C&O and let the C&O take it up through Washington, D.C. and then up to New York City. And that lasted for about a year or two. I had overlooked that there was also a dining car on this train. It was, the train was basically an evening train out of Roanoke and a morning train back into Roanoke. So what they were doing is that the dining car, the dining car would be on between Roanoke and Waynesboro. They switch it out at Waynesboro. They had an engine there to take care of that, and some yard staff to do the air brake test and everything. And it would lay over a few hours and then be coupled on to the southbound train and serve breakfast. So no lunch ever served in that dining car. If you look for menus, a lot of the NNW menus will say, the Cavalier or the Pocahontas or the Powhatan Arrow. This train never really had a name. Trains 1 and 2 never had a name other than they were just called the New York trains. And so the menus do not have that designation. It's a breakfast or a dinner menu. And a lot of times, they're pretty good on the NNW. They were picking local scenes. The scenes that were along the Shenandoah Valley are the ones that appear on the front of the menu for the period of time that they were printing a picture on the front of the menu. So just that little side tidbit.
Is that Pensy line still intact, do you think?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you think that line from the Pennsylvania Railroad line north of Harrisburg, Hagerstown, is that still in existence?
Oh, yeah. Yes, it is.
Winchester and Western now?
No. The Harrisburg to Hagerstown, as you may know, when they closed down Potomac Yard, Norfolk Southern rerouted all of its traffic to go from Manassas over to Riverton Junction, and then up by Boyce, and then to Hagerstown, and then it goes from Hagerstown through Carlisle up to Harrisburg and into Enola Yard. So this has really become the new main line of Norfolk Southern. A lot of times you see a station that's been saved and it's alongside a line that has maybe 1 or 2 trains a day, or maybe a train a week, if you're lucky. This Boyce Depot is now adjoining a line that probably has 10 to 12 trains a day. because it's basically all of the Norfolk Southern traffic coming that comes up the former Southern Railway, as well as some that comes up out of Roanoke on the former N&W, and continues north to Enola. And then, of course, from Enola, you go east, west, and north to all the markets. So a very, very heavily traveled line. So just to clarify, the line from Hagerstown to Harrisburg, that's the former Cumberland Valley, that's very much in use. I don't think there are very many Cumberland Valley stations that remain. At least I've never seen very many. I've been to Chambersburg and looked around, and I don't think the station is still there, but it might be. But not many others are. I don't think there is in Carlisle, and that's a topic for a different discussion. But unfortunately, the Hagerstown station's gone, and of course, Hagerstown is a shadow of what it used to be when, with no real Western Maryland presence and CSX going in there, and then discontinuing a lot of the Western Maryland trackage.
What kind of shape is Antietam Station in?
Antietam Station's in good shape. The last time I saw it was quite a while back, but it's a wooden station, but it's owned by the Model Railroad Club. It's been moved away from the N&W right-of-way and has been, like I say, rotated 180 degrees. So the part that faces the track, now the back of the building sort of faces the track, and it's on private land. I don't think they had to move it too far. And it's a Model Railroad Club. I've never gone in to see the Model Railroad display. That's on a bucket list that probably I'll never be able to have time to empty that bucket, but I'd like to.
You get there 9 o'clock this Saturday, you'll be able to.
I'm sorry, what's going on at 9 o'clock?
Well, the Winchester chapter hasn't.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Well,
this Saturday, 9 o'clock.
Yeah, the trouble is for me, Saturday, the high school that I went to in Alexandria is having a memorial, a plaque dedication outside of the building. And I'm the secretary of that alumni association. I got to be there to take pictures, and then we got a board meeting. So you'll just have to go take a look at Antietam and take plenty of pictures and send them to me.
I will. So it's an original old wooden station then?
Yeah, it's an original wooden station. It's the same style of station that was down at Hollins and Cloverdale and Buchanan and Natural Bridge. Those are the stations that come to mind. There are probably others that, had that similar N&W station design.
How did it survive then?
Well, I'm not sure about the history of that. I just know that the Model Railroad Club apparently bought it fairly on, and they agreed to move it away from the track. And then I see Alex Kohler says the Lurgan branch is Hagerstown to Harrisburg. Okay, well, that's, I guess, what it is. I'm not sure that PW, wait a second, who's PW?
Paul Woodring,
Oh, Paul, okay. He's saying that the sleeping car might have been on the Admiral. It could be. Like I say, anybody, just my email address is, wait a second. There, if you write it down, since you can't really do cut and paste off of a screen, but if you write it down, my shorter email address is f_shear@yahoo.com. But I checked both email addresses. If you go ahead and write that down and say, hey, send me the, consist for some of the trains for the sleeper connection. And like I say, the 1961, it's relatively late. I would very, very much like to see earlier consist, earlier information. So far, I've not really found any N&W consist books that go back much earlier that explain some of that activity.
Frank, did you say the natural bridge is on this line that Boyce is on?
I'd say it a little slower and a little louder.
Yeah, I've got a lot of echo here. Did you say that natural bridge is on the
Yeah,
same
natural
line as
bridge.
Boyce?
Natural bridge is on this line. It crosses over top, crosses over top of the CNO.
Yeah, that's right. I'm familiar with Balcony Falls, which is on the CNO near Natural Bridge.
Yeah, there was, in 1970, there was a 4501 trip out of Roanoke that went up to Shenandoah and back.
Yeah, that was good.
And, one of the best pictures that I saw is that,
Come across the
of that bridge that goes over the James River there at Natural Bridge. The 4501 coming across that. But of course, the Natural Bridge station has been closed, and apparently the N&W station, I think there was just a waiting shelter for the CNO that there were maybe 100 steps down. It's almost a vertical drop from the N&W down to where the CNO is. And maybe I'm exaggerating by saying 100 steps. I never actually saw it. But apparently there was a wooden walkway, wooden stairway that went down so that you could make a connection between the two railroads. Of course, that's the James River subdivision of the CNO, and that's primarily a freight and especially coal hauling route. It lost its passenger service in 1958. And, so that was fairly early on. And I think Indian Rock was just another shelter. They didn't, they did have stations elsewhere, but such as Eagle Rock. Anyway, Natural Bridge is on that line. In the early days of the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, what they were trying to do was to build passenger traffic of excursions that would take you down to Luray Caverns. So there were quite a few, and in fact, in the early days, the main connection at Hagerstown was not the Pennsylvania or the Cumberland Valley Railroad. It was the Western Maryland Railroad coming out of Baltimore. And it made the connection to the Shenandoah Valley Railroad. So you'll see a situation where there were a lot of Western Maryland, Shenandoah Valley Railroad excursions going down to Luray and back. And that and of course the Natural Bridge itself, which is about 4 or 5 miles away from Natural Bridge Station, was the other attraction, but nothing like Luray. Luray was really the big traffic driver. If you look at some of the annual reports for the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, aside from Roanoke and Hagerstown, the passenger traffic of arrivals and departures were heavily slighted in favor of Luray.
Luray used to be pretty popular. I don't know about now. I don't know how it would compare with Thomas the Bank Engine, but.
Well, yeah, Luray's still very popular, it's a private. One of the interesting, I mentioned briefly that I acquired some papers that belonged to Upton L. Boyce. Apparently even back in the 1880s, it was a private corporation that was issuing shares of stock. And he had 20 shares of stock in the Luray Corporation. I think the Norfolk and Western, after that, tried to increase its ownership. Again, this is the same concept as a streetcar company putting an amusement park at the end of the line so that on weekends and evening hours and so on like that, people who are not commuting or otherwise using the streetcar have a reason to get on the streetcar and go to the end of the line. And Luray was very much like that, and not exactly halfway between Roanoke and Hagerstown, but it served the same purpose. It was a natural attraction that drew people. It wasn't an amusement park, but had a lot of the characteristics of an amusement park as a health spa and, a natural wonder. People were amazed. it's hard for people, I think, today we're so used to amazing things that, you know, when you start thinking about a cave that's thousands of years old and the stalactites and the stalagmites, that was absolutely amazing. And some people viewed that for the first time. And it was just a real wonder. The days of visiting caverns, people still do, but I don't think it has the same attraction as it did back in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 20th century. Other questions? Well, again, I appreciate the invite to speak with you all tonight, to share some time. And Boyce Depot is a rail fan friendly place. You know, it says parking by permission on the sign. As long as you don't get on the track, nobody's going to question you standing out there taking pictures to your heart's delight. And it's not like some other places that you go where people are going to try to run you off the property. So with that, please do write down the contact information so that you've got it, and send me a note afterwards if you want more information.
Yeah, thanks again, Frank.
was
And can I
great.
ask
Thank you.
everyone can everyone just unmute for a moment? We'll just give Frank a hand here for giving us a great program tonight.
Thank you very much.
Back on your
Very good.
feet.
Thank you,
Thank you
Frank.
very much, Frank.
Thank you very much.
Well done,
You're
Frank.
welcome.